The moment my boots hit the tarmac in San Marina, the coastal heat swallowed me whole. It wasn't just the oppressive dampness of the tropics, nor the chaotic symphony of the airport arrivals terminal that made my breath catch. It was the electric, terrifying thrill vibrating in my ribs. My hands physically shook as I powered on my phone. 7 missed calls from Julian. He had absolutely no idea I was breathing the same air as him again. For 4 grueling years, I had frozen half to death in Aberdeen, working back-to-back shifts at a senior care facility. Every penny I saved, every hour of sleep I sacrificed was meant for this exact night. I had told him my contract was extended for another 14 months. A lie, of course. I just desperately craved that cinematic moment, the raw shock on his face when he opens the door, the tears, the crushing hug where he'd bury his face in my neck and say, "You're finally mine again." But reality rarely plays out like the movies. The man driving my cab, Mateo, kept catching my eye in the rearview mirror. He used to drive Julian and me to the Sunday markets before I left. "Señora Clara," Mateo mumbled, tapping his steering wheel with calloused fingers. "Are you entirely sure you don't want me to ring him, just to give a quick warning?" I shook my head, smiling so hard my cheeks ached. "No, Mateo, let him be surprised." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the cab window, drinking in the messy streets of my hometown. The neon signs flickering over corner bodegas, the heavy scent of frying empanadas mingling with diesel exhaust. God, I missed this beautiful mess. I absent-mindedly twisted the silver band on my thumb. Julian had slipped it on my hand the rainy morning I left. He had cupped my cheeks, his eyes red and exhausted. "Go make that money, baby," he had whispered, his voice cracking. "I'll keep our foundation strong here." I swallowed that promise whole. Mateo finally turned onto our avenue, and the massive wrought iron gates of the villa came into view. The sprawling terracotta-roofed house I had bled for, wired thousands of dollars back home to build, stood tall against the night sky. But my stomach did a slow, uncomfortable flip. The porch fixtures were sleek and modern, completely different from the vintage brass lanterns I had picked out online. The wild bougainvillea bushes I insisted on keeping were gone, replaced by neatly trimmed, sterile hedges. Mateo honked. A young guy in a security uniform, a complete stranger, poked his head out the side door. "Can I help you?" he asked, not making a single move to open the gate. I stepped out into the muggy air, grabbing my duffel bag. "I'm the homeowner. Let me in." The kid looked me up and down, thoroughly confused. "Ma'am, Mr. Julian went out of town for the weekend." My smile faltered, but I forced my voice to stay light. "That's fine. I have my keys." I marched up to the pedestrian door and shoved my key into the lock. It wouldn't budge. I jiggled it. Harder. Nothing. My stomach turned to lead. I pounded my fists against the heavy mahogany door. I heard footsteps shuffling from inside. Faint, light footsteps. A woman's footsteps. My brow furrowed. The doors swung inward, moving painfully slow. And there she was. Elena, my roommate from college, the maid of honor at my wedding. Elena, draped in my oversized emerald green silk kimono. Elena, barefoot. Her dark curls pinned up with the ivory claw clip I had frantically searched for before I packed my bags 3 years ago. Elena, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, looking exactly like a cornered animal. The air vanished from the porch. We just stood there, caught in a suffocating, soundless vacuum. When my voice finally broke the silence, it sounded paper thin. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Elena blinked fast, her chest rising and falling erratically. "Clara, Please, this isn't what you're thinking, Elena stammered, grabbing the doorframe. A sharp, humorless laugh burst out of my chest. Then tell me, Elena, what exactly is it? Elena stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door partially shut behind her. Keep your voice down, she hissed urgently. Keep my voice down? I repeated, my accent spiking sharply as the adrenaline hit my bloodstream. You are standing on my porch, wearing my clothes, and you're telling me to lower my voice? The kid at the gate had suddenly become very interested in inspecting his cuticles, pretending he couldn't hear every word. Let's go inside, please, Elena pleaded, her voice trembling. I didn't budge. My boots felt glued to the concrete. Where is Julian? She swallowed hard. He's not here. I heard the security guard. Where is he? The tension stretched between us, thick and ugly. Elena, I said, dropping my voice dangerously low, explain to me why you have the keys to my home. She couldn't meet my eyes. She looked down at her bare feet. And right then, the floor gave out beneath me. I shoved past her shoulder, marching straight into the foyer. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Vanilla and sandalwood. It wasn't my scent. My duffel bag slipped from my shoulder, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. I started walking toward the stairs. I couldn't feel my legs moving. Clara, please, Elena sobbed, trailing behind me. The door to the master suite was cracked open. I pushed it wide. The heavy duvet cover I had painstakingly ordered from Italy was gone. The walls, which we had painted a warm, inviting sage, were stark white. But that wasn't what stopped my breathing. On the nightstand sat 3 framed photographs, not of Julian and me. Julian and Elena at a vineyard, laughing. Too close, intimate. My lungs seized. I couldn't drag in enough air. 4 years of wiring 80% of my paychecks into his investment accounts. 4 years of working holiday shifts, sending money to cover the mortgage he swore he was struggling to pay. 4 years of exhausted late-night FaceTime calls, desperately trying to keep a marriage alive across an ocean. Behind me, Elena broke down completely. It happened slowly, she gasped out. He was so isolated. I was just trying to be a friend. I turned around, moving like I was underwater. A friend? I spat. You were being a friend by playing house in my bed? She shook her head wildly, tears streaming down her face. You don't understand. He told me you were never coming back. I just stared at her, blank. What? He said you met a doctor in Scotland. He said you moved on. The words didn't make sense. They scrambled in my brain. I let out another cracked laugh. Are you out of your mind? I was wiping beds and changing catheters 12 hours a day. Elena wiped her face, smearing her makeup. He said you fell out of love. He told me you were only sending the money because you felt guilty. My mind flashed violently through every memory. Every "I love you, babe" whispered through a terrible connection. Every prayer we mumbled together before hanging up. Had he been acting the entire time? My phone vibrated violently against my palm. The screen lit up. Julian. Elena and I stared at the glowing letters. I swiped to answer. Hello? I said. My voice was eerily steady, even as the room tilted dangerously around me. Clara? He said, his tone tight, cautious. Where are you? I looked at the framed photo of him kissing my best friend's cheek. I'm home. Dead silence on the line. Then a heavy sigh. You really should have given me a heads up, Clara. I wanted to surprise you, I replied flatly. Another agonizing pause. Look, he said, his voice dropping into that serious tone he always used when negotiating. We need to have a conversation. A cold, unfamiliar smile stretched across my face. "Yes," I said quietly, "we absolutely do." Outside, the sky finally broke. A crack of thunder shook the windows of the house I had bled for. The rain started pouring down in sheets. I realized with a sickening clarity that I was standing inside a house that hadn't belonged to me in a very long time. But I wasn't running away. Not a chance. There was a rot deep underneath this betrayal, and I was going to rip the floorboards up to see exactly how far down it went. Memories flooded my brain like a slideshow. The Tuesday he called hyperventilating because the contractor needed another 10 grand. The wire transfers I rationalized as marital sacrifice. And Elena. I remembered when she flew out to see me in Aberdeen. We squeezed into my tiny flat eating microwaved pasta. She had hugged me so tight at the airport. "You're so strong, Clara. I could never endure this." A sickening chill crawled up my spine. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Elena flinched. "What?" "How long have you been sleeping under my roof?" She hesitated. That split-second pause screamed the truth louder than words ever could. 2 years, she choked out. 2 years? I blinked, the room spinning slightly. "So I leave and 12 months later you pack your bags and move in?" "It wasn't like that," she scrambled. "He was terrified. There were break-ins down the street. He said the house felt like a tomb and he just needed someone around to feel safe." I let out a dry, rattling breath. "Right, so you graciously volunteered to be the armed guard, and you patrolled the property from my side of the mattress?" She dissolved into tears again. "It just happened gradually." "Gradually?" I scoffed. "Like sleeping with your best friend's husband was a slippery slope you just accidentally tumbled down?" Then, the sweep of headlights sliced through the rain, illuminating the bedroom wall. We both froze. The heavy purr of an engine cut out in the driveway. Julian was home. I pulled my shoulders back, the numbness morphing into cold, hard steel. "Stop crying," I snapped at Elena. "Wipe your face." Downstairs, the front door clicked open. His footsteps echoed up the hardwood stairs. Slow. Deliberate. He didn't call out my name. When he pushed the bedroom door open, he froze in the frame. For a fraction of a second, I saw it. Raw, naked panic. But it vanished instantly, hardening into a cold, calculating mask. "Clara," he said. His voice didn't waver. "Julian." Elena scrambled off the edge of the mattress. "I'll go make some tea." "Sit down," I commanded. Elena glanced at Julian helplessly. He gave her a microscopic nod, and she sank back onto the duvet. I finally took a good look at the man I had been breaking my back for. He didn't look like a struggling, lonely husband. He looked incredibly comfortable. His jaw was sharply lined, his beard professionally faded, and wrapped around his left wrist was a heavy silver Rolex. I certainly hadn't wired him money for that. "You changed the deadbolts," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I did," he replied, leaning against the doorframe. "Why?" He took a slow, measured breath. "We are not doing this while you're hysterical, Clara." "Hysterical?" I tilted my head, genuinely amused. "I'm not hysterical, Julian. I'm taking notes. Go on." He looked at Elena as if drawing strength from her before locking eyes with me. "You left." The sheer audacity of those 2 words nearly knocked the wind out of me. "I left to work, to pay for the roof currently over your head." "You abandoned this marriage," he fired back, stepping into the room. "You left me to rot here for 3 years." "Did I stop calling?" I shot back, my voice finally rising. "Did I stop sending every dime I made? Did I stop holding on?" "You changed," he yelled, Every time we talked, it was just my shift this, my rotation that. You were a ghost. You were always exhausted. I let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. I was exhausted because I was working 14-hour days, Julian. A marriage needs more than bank transfers, Clara. It also requires not sleeping with my bridesmaid. But here we are, I spat. Elena flinched as if I'd slapped her. Julian's face flushed dark red. Watch your mouth in my house. Watch my mouth? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Elena suddenly blundered out, "He thought you were embarrassed by him, Clara. He thought he didn't want him in Scotland because he didn't have a degree." I stared at him, utterly floored. "Is that really what you thought?" He jutted his chin out, refusing to deny it. "You could have picked up the phone and asked me," I said, the betrayal carving a hollow space in my chest. "You could have actually been here," he countered smoothly. I exhaled a long, shaky breath. "So, to fix your bruised ego, you moved my best friend into our bed." Julian's eyes darkened. He didn't look ashamed. He looked defiant. "I didn't plan on falling in love with her." The words hit me like a physical punch to the throat. Elena let out a tiny, pathetic gasp. I felt the last remnants of the girl I used to be die right there on the hardwood floor. "Love?" I whispered, tasting blood on the inside of my cheek. "Yes," he said, without an ounce of hesitation. "And you love him?" I looked at Elena. She squeezed her eyes shut. I care about him deeply, Clara." An hysterical laugh bubbled up in my chest, but I bit it down. How perfectly domestic. The two of you building your little love story inside the house I bought, using the money I bled for. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. "You didn't buy anything, Clara. This isn't your house." The room went completely silent. Only the rain lashing against the glass made a sound. "Excuse me?" I breathed. "The deed is entirely in my name." My heart slammed against my ribs. "No, we signed the papers together. Joint ownership." Julian looked at me with a chilling sort of pity. "You were thousands of miles away. The lawyers needed physical signatures. I did what was practical." My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I gripped the edge of the dresser to steady myself. "You forged my signature on the property deeds?" "I streamlined the process," he corrected coldly. The true horror of the last 4 years finally snapped into focus. So all those international wire transfers? "Gifts," Julian said, his voice as smooth as glass. "Voluntary financial gifts to your husband to support his investments, legally speaking, of course." The betrayal mutated into a monster I didn't recognize. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't about loneliness or bruised egos or feeling abandoned. It was a calculated, meticulously executed financial heist. While I was scrubbing bedpans and living on instant noodles in freezing Scotland, he was quietly transferring my entire future into his own name. I closed my eyes, my mind racing through the blur of paperwork I had hastily scribbled my name on before rushing to the airport. Power of attorney, bank authorizations. I had handed him the keys to my life because I thought we were a team. I never bothered to double check. When I opened my eyes, the shock was gone. What replaced it was a cold, terrifying clarity. They thought I was just going to cry and walk away. They had no idea. "You planned this," I stated. It wasn't a question. He shook his head, his face an emotionless mask. "I adapted to the circumstances." I closed the distance between us, standing inches from his chest. "Do you have any concept of what I did to earn that money, Julian?" He looked over my shoulder, unable to meet my eyes. I mopped up blood and vomit. I worked back-to-back night shifts holding the hands of dying people who didn't remember their own names. I missed my sister's wedding. I missed my father's funeral. My voice finally cracked, a tiny fracture in the armor. And you adapted? Elena started sobbing again, loud, ugly gasps. Julian's facade cracked for a millisecond, but his ego propped him back up. You cannot disappear for 3 years and expect time to stand still, Clara, he reasoned coldly. I nodded slowly, letting the truth wash over me. You're absolutely right. He blinked, clearly thrown by my agreement. I turned around, walked calmly to the nightstand, and picked up one of the framed photos. I traced the glass over their smiling faces. You look incredibly happy here, I observed quietly. Neither of them said a word. The silence in the room was suffocating. I set the frame down with deliberate care. Answer one question for me, I said, turning back to face him. If I hadn't shown up unannounced tonight, when exactly were you going to tell me? Julian hesitated. His eyes darted to the floor. Elena answered for him. He was going to file for divorce, she whimpered. The floor seemed to drop out beneath me again. Next month, Elena added, her voice barely audible. The edges of my vision blurred, the room swaying slightly, but I dug my heels into the floorboards and forced myself to stay upright. Divorce? I repeated, my voice devoid of inflection. Yes, Julian said, his spine stiffening as he regained his nerve. I stared at the man I had promised my life to. I stared at him for a long, heavy moment, and then I did the very last thing either of them expected. I smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy or even of madness. It was the smile of absolute, crystal-clear realization. The game board had been set, and they thought they were the only ones playing. Did you honestly think I came back completely blind, Julian? I asked softly. His brow furrowed. The arrogant confidence flickered. What are you talking about? I didn't answer. I walked past them, out of the bedroom, and headed downstairs. I heard them scrambling to follow me, their footsteps loud against the hardwood. I went straight to my duffel bag in the foyer. I unzipped a hidden compartment and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I didn't fly 15 hours just to give you a surprise party, I said calmly, dropping the envelope on the granite kitchen island. What is that? Julian demanded, eyeing the package like it was a live grenade. I held his gaze. Insurance. Julian tore the envelope open. Out slid a stack of meticulously highlighted bank statements, notarized property agreements, and a thick legal document stamped with the crest of a Scottish solicitor's office. Julian's face drained of color. Elena crept closer, clutching her silk robe tight against her chest. What does it say? She asked, her voice trembling. I kept my voice perfectly even. Before I moved to Aberdeen, I sat down with a lawyer and registered an international joint asset protection order. Any property or significant asset purchased using my foreign earnings is legally locked under marital protection law. Julian stared at the dense legalese, his hands finally shaking. You can't enforce a foreign legal document in a domestic court, he spat, trying to sound authoritative. I won't have to, I replied easily, tapping a specific clause highlighted in yellow. Because every single transfer I made was formally documented as a foreign investment contribution. If you try to contest ownership, it instantly triggers an international wire fraud investigation. Elena let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Julian's breathing turned ragged. You're bluffing, he growled. I tilted my head, smiling coldly. Call your lawyer in the morning and ask. The storm outside had finally passed, but the air inside that house was lethal. Julian looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. I wasn't the naive girl he sent away. I wasn't the exhausted ATM he drained for 3 years. He had vastly underestimated me. But the night wasn't over, because the ace up my sleeve was going to burn this entire house to the ground. "There's something else," I said quietly. They both froze, bracing themselves. "What now?" Julian demanded, panic bleeding into his voice. I took a slow, deep breath. "The real reason I came home early is because someone has been watching this house." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with a creeping dread. Neither of them knew how to process that sentence. Julian's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the granite island. Elena looked like she might pass out, her breathing shallow and erratic. "What the hell do you mean someone has been watching the house?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking. I didn't answer right away. I walked over to the front window and pulled the heavy drape aside just a fraction, looking out into the slick, wet driveway. "For the past 8 months," I began quietly, "I've been receiving anonymous emails." Julian's eyes narrowed to slits. "Emails regarding what?" "Regarding you." Elena shifted uneasily, wrapping her arms around her stomach. "Initially, I brushed them off," I admitted, turning to face them. "I thought it was just malicious gossip. People get jealous when someone goes abroad and starts sending money back. I figured someone was just trying to stir up trouble." I walked slowly back to the kitchen island. But then the emails got specific. Times, dates, locations, financial transactions. Julian's jaw tightened defensively. "What kind of specifics?" I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and unlocked it. I tapped open a hidden folder and slid the device across the granite surface. Elena whimpered. The screen displayed a crisp photo of her and Julian sitting on the patio of an upscale restaurant downtown. His hand was resting intimately on her thigh under the table. The timestamp was from a weekend he explicitly told me he was attending a real estate seminar in another city. I reached over and swiped the screen. A short video clip played, the two of them walking up the driveway on this very house at 2 a.m, laughing, her arm wrapped around his waist. I swiped again, screenshots of banking alerts, massive withdrawals, direct wire transfers from Julian's primary account into an account registered under Elena's name. Julian looked up at me, pure shock replacing the anger. "How did you get these?" I held his gaze. "Does it matter?" "Yes, it absolutely matters," he shouted, losing his composure. I studied him, enjoying the panic in his eyes. "You really want to know who sold you out?" "Tell me," he demanded. I shifted my gaze to my former best friend. "I think Elena should hear this too." Elena's lips quivered. Please, just tell us." I inhaled the stale, tense air of the kitchen. "It was your fiancé, Elena." The kitchen erupted. "What, her fiancé?" Julian roared, whipping his head toward her. "Your fiancé," I repeated calmly. "You don't have a fiancé," Julian yelled, stepping toward her aggressively. Elena stumbled backward, grabbing the back of a bar stool to keep from falling. I was engaged, Julian, before." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them sweat. "His name is Marcus." Elena's face lost every ounce of its remaining color. She looked like she might throw up right there on the granite floor. "He found me on Instagram a few months ago," I explained, leaning against the counter. I thought it was a scam at first, just some creep looking for a payout. But he knew things. He knew about the villa. He knew Julian's work schedule. Julian whipped his head back and forth between us. What the hell is she talking about? Elena covered her mouth with both hands, a muffled sob escaping her lips. "Marcus told me you broke off your engagement out of nowhere," No explanation, no closure. You just blocked his number and vanished. So, he got curious. He followed you after your shift at the clinic one night. He saw you pull into my driveway. He did a little digging, figured out who the property belonged to, and decided to send me a message. Julian stepped backward, bumping into the refrigerator. He stared at Elena like she was a complete stranger. "You were engaged?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. It was before things got serious between us. I let out a harsh bark of laughter. Don't lie to him, Elena. It overlapped by 6 months. The sheer weight of that truth seemed to crush the oxygen out of the room. Elena had been playing both of them, and Julian had just realized his precious, devoted replacement was built on a massive lie. Julian ran both hands over his face, dragging his fingers through his hair. "So this guy Marcus has just been spying on us? For months?" "He was gathering evidence," I corrected sharply. "He said he wanted me to know the reality of my situation before I threw away another decade of my life." Julian's jaw clenched. That bastard had no right to invade my privacy. "And you had no right to invite my best friend into my bed." The silence returned, but it wasn't the explosive kind anymore. It was heavy, final. Elena sank onto one of the bar stools, defeated. "I didn't plan for this to happen, Clara," she whispered, her voice cracking. "When you moved to Scotland, I was so incredibly lonely. You were the only real friend I had here. Then Julian started calling me, asking me to help fix things around the house, asking me to look over legal paperwork." She looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. "He told me you barely talk to him anymore. He said you were turning into a different person. He made me feel important, needed. He used to compare me to you and say I understood him so much better." Julian flinched. He actually flinched. Elena stared at him, her heartbreak mixing with a sudden, bitter anger. "You swore she was completely done with you." Julian didn't even try to deny it. He just stared at the floor. I felt something heavy and dark settle in the pit of my stomach. "You both constructed this entire fantasy on a foundation of lies, and now you're shocked that the floor is caving in." Julian's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with desperate anger. "Don't stand there acting like a saint, Clara. You left your marriage wide open. You abandoned us." "I left to secure our financial survival," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I trusted you to protect the home I was paying for." He had absolutely nothing to say to that. I picked up the manila envelope from the counter. "I spoke to my attorney in the city the minute my plane landed. The paperwork is already filed. At the bare minimum, you cannot sell, transfer, or leverage this property without my legal consent." His shoulders slumped in defeat. And, I said, my voice softening, not out of weakness, but absolute finality. "I'm filing for divorce." Elena started sobbing all over again. Julian looked completely blindsided. "You're just ending it? Just like that?" "Just like that?" I repeated gently. "Julian, you ended this 2 years ago." The words seemed to cut him deeper than any screaming match ever could. He opened his mouth to argue, to plead, to make another excuse. He slowly shut it instead. I looked around the sleek, unfamiliar kitchen. I didn't fly across an ocean to fight another woman for a man who already made his choice, I told them. And I am certainly not going to beg for a spot in a house that I paid to build. I turned on my heel and walked toward the stairs. "Where do you think you're going?" Julian asked, his voice tight with panic. "To get some sleep." "Here? In this house?" I stopped with my hand on the banister and looked back at him. "Yes, in my house." He stared at me, clearly wanting to protest, but something in my face shut him down completely. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hysterical. I was the authority in the room, and he finally knew it. Hours later, the house settled into an uneasy, suffocating quiet. I lay flat on my back in the guest bedroom. I didn't cry. I didn't scream into a pillow. I just stared at the ceiling fan and let the reality of it wash over me. The betrayal, the utter humiliation, the stupid, blind trust I had given him. But underneath all of that garbage, I felt something else entirely. Relief. The mental fog I had been fighting for years was finally gone. I didn't have to wonder why he was acting distant anymore. I didn't have to kill myself working double shifts to meet his arbitrary financial demands. The truth was ugly, but it cleared the air like a thunderstorm. Downstairs, I could hear the muffled sounds of a vicious argument. Julian and Elena. I couldn't make out the exact words, but the venom in their voices was unmistakable. That little alliance they built in the dark felt thrilling to them, but the second it was dragged into the light, it began to rot. By morning, the entire landscape of my life had shifted. I woke up just after sunrise and stepped out onto the second-floor balcony. The air smelled sharp and clean after the rain. The city was already waking up. The distant blare of car horns, the smell of street vendors roasting plantains. Life was moving forward, entirely indifferent to the wreckage of my marriage. I heard the sliding glass door scrape open behind me. I didn't turn around. Julian stepped out onto the balcony. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes wrinkled. "Elena left," he said quietly. I turned to face him, leaning my elbows against the railing. "Where to?" "She packed up at dawn. She's gone." He swallowed hard. "Clara, I made mistakes. I thought you were drifting away. And instead of reaching out to the wife who was bleeding herself dry for you," I said softly, the morning breeze catching my hair, "you simply replaced me with the closest available option." He dropped his gaze to the wet pavement. "I was horribly insecure. I felt like less of a man." "That's a reason, Julian. It is absolutely not an excuse," I replied. "I know." We stood there, the emotional distance between us wider than the Atlantic Ocean. Finally, he looked up, his eyes glassy and pleading. "Clara, is there any possible chance?" I raised my hand, cutting him off instantly. "Don't. Do not ask to keep something you couldn't be bothered to protect." A tear spilled over his lashes, but my heart remained solid ice. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it doesn't always demand reconciliation. Some bridges need to burn so you can see the path forward by the firelight. "I'm staying in San Marino," I told him, turning my back to the sunrise. "We will handle the divorce through our attorneys. Don't try to contact me directly." He nodded, utterly defeated. "And Julian?" I paused at the sliding glass door. "Yes? Never mistake a woman's sacrifice for stupidity again." The words nailed him to the balcony floor. The next few months were a brutal, exhausting marathon. We formally filed the divorce papers. The lawyers tore through our assets, ordered a full evaluation of the villa, and divided the remains of our shared life. It was incredibly ugly. There were screaming matches over phone lines, desperate interventions from his embarrassed family, and endless accusations. But I never wavered. I refused to let his betrayal turn me into a bitter, hollow shell. Instead, I did exactly what he feared most. I started over. I didn't run back to the freezing rain of Scotland. I planted my feet right here in San Marino. I took every hard lesson I learned managing those chaotic Scottish hospital wards and opened a private home healthcare agency. It started in a tiny leased office, but word of mouth spread. People respected the hustle. The neighborhood gossips definitely whispered about the spectacular collapse of my marriage, but scandal always dies down when success starts making a louder noise. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, an email popped up. It was from Marcus. It contained a single line: "I genuinely hope you're healing." I read it twice, smiled, and archived the thread. I didn't reply. It wasn't out of malice or ingratitude. He had blown my life apart to save me, and I respected that. But I didn't need anyone to rescue me anymore. I locked up my agency office on a muggy Thursday evening, the sunset painting the San Marino skyline in bruised shades of violet and gold. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, thinking about that awful, rainy night I arrived at the villa with my duffel bag, expecting a movie-perfect reunion, and finding an absolute nightmare instead. If I could time travel back and talk to that exhausted, hopeful version of myself, standing on the porch, I wouldn't tell her to run away. I'd tell her to kick the door open anyway. Because sometimes the catastrophic shock you spend your whole life dreading is actually the exact doorway you need to walk through to find your freedom. We eventually sold the villa. I took my rightful half, invested it into my business, and never looked back. Julian downgraded to a cramped flat across town. Elena vanished from the city entirely. As for me, I learned the hardest, most expensive lesson of my life. Distance doesn't kill love. Lying does. Suffering and sacrificing for someone doesn't guarantee their loyalty. Their character does. And the most agonizing heartbreak can easily become the foundation for a much stronger life. As the evening traffic roared to life along the avenue, I walked toward my car. I was alone, yes, but I was finally awake.